mammals on Earth eat? Basically, they eat anything that they can catch, pick, or gather. So all of those are foods that are purely produced by the planet, by Mother Earth. And they eat anything that is or was recently part of a living and breathing ecosystem here on the planet. So if we look at food in that perspective, we can see the stark contrast between that and anything that we pick up in the grocery store. So what do we want to feed Homo sapiens? Well, first off, we want to have a good protein source. We want to eat meat, fish, fowl, any sort of animal that runs around. But we want to eat the animals that had a natural life and that have been fed and eating things that are natural for them. So most of the beef, or all of the beef that you buy in the store, is corn-fed. And corn is not a natural food for a cow. A cow would never select corn to eat if you give him a choice. But in those food-raising plants, they don't have a choice, so they eat the corn and they get really sick and they need medication and chemicals to tolerate it. So that makes a beef, a food, that's just not very suitable. It's not a quality food. Then we want to eat nuts and fruits and berries, and we want to eat them in the form that nature produces them. One of my favorite pet peeves is whenever they say made from. Because whenever they say made from whatever it is, if it's made from apples, well, if it's not an apple anymore, it's not an apple anymore. So when you make something from something, it's totally irrelevant. When you mess with it, it's not what it used to be, and it can't provide the nutrients and participate in your ecology the way that it did before. And we want to eat vegetables and roots like carrots and potatoes and different things. And we want to eat very limited whole grains. We can eat some, we can tolerate a little bit, but we're not really made to eat a lot of grains. So let's just give an example of that. Let's talk about wheat. There's an epidemic of wheat intolerance and celiac disease. And what could that be? Where could that be from? Well, let's look historically. 10,000 years ago, and the time period we're looking back here, our ancestors probably ate some wheat. But they had two kinds of wheat. They were called emmer and einkorn. And they had 40% protein. Then 9,000 years ago, there was a natural hybrid, and we had a third kind of wheat called triticum something. And that was all the time. That was 3 wheats all the way up till modern times. And today, and in the last few decades, it has exploded into 25,000 types of wheat. And that's happened with hybridization by mixing species. But more disturbingly, it's happening with genetic manipulation. So they go in and through manipulation, they insert and extract genetic traits and genetic code from these foodstuffs. And we don't really know how they're going to interact with our body long term because they've never been part of the food chain. It is not a natural food anymore. And if you look at one thing, the traits that they try to develop is not flavor or nutrition, it is resistance to weather and pesticides. Those are the basic things that they're interested in developing. And in doing this, they're changing important characteristics of the food. It's not the same food anymore. It doesn't have a natural genetic makeup. And one example we can talk about is the protein. It used to be, back here, it was 40% protein. Today, normal wheat, the average wheat has 12% protein. So it's just not something that comes from nature anymore. And of course, the fast food industry, the next cartoon here, our challenge is to convince the public that heart attacks are sexy. If they can just do that, then, well, they're pretty close. They're pretty close. So when we talk about food priorities, there's so many different things to keep track of. What do we do? Where do we start? Well, the first thing that I want to recommend, and these are my opinions, I would say balance blood sugar. If you're just going to do one thing with your food choices, you want to balance blood sugar. That means you lower sugar, starch, and alcohol, and you get good quality vegetables, protein, and fat. Secondly, you want to eat more whole foods, more live foods, and more raw foods. That's the way all other animals eat them. That's the way they occur in nature. That's the way they fit the best into your biology. That means you eat less packaged, less processed, and definitely less additives and chemicals as well. Thirdly, if you want to start getting a little more picky, then you want to start trying to balance your pH. And that means you want to try to get it in the alkaline direction, because most people today are very, very acidic, that most of the things we eat, such as grain and protein and processed foods, are very acidic. The alkaline foods are going to be fruits and vegetables and anything that is naturally water rich. And then lastly, you want to start trying to reduce the poison and increase the nutrient concentration. You want to try to raise the quality of the food that you eat. And that means you want to start looking for organic food, you want to start looking for free range and local and sustainable foods. And what this does is the poison obviously doesn't belong in your body, it interferes with your biological processes. And also, when you feed a plant or an animal or a vegetable or a berry, if you feed it artificial nutrients, then it basically gets bloated and big and pretty, but it doesn't have much nutrient content in it. So when you eat organic and local and sustainable, then you're increasing your nutrient concentration as well as reducing the poison. So let's real quick go over and talk about what's required to maintain health. So what would you say if you're trying to raise a plant and the plant isn't doing too well? What's the first thing that you're going to give it?
Water.
Water, okay. So now you're feeding it, you're watering your plant, but it's still not doing very well. What's the next thing that you would think of?
Appropriate sunlight.
Sunlight, exactly. So now you're giving it water and sunlight, and it's still not very happy. What are you thinking? Soil, exactly. Because plants need three things. You can ask a 5-year-old. So I'm not trying to make you look bad here. A 5-year-old will know that you got to put the plant in the soil, and you have to give it water, and you have to give it sunlight. So for the life form called plants, those elements are required. How many times, if you try 1,000,000 times to raise a plant and you give it 2 out of 3, you put it in the soil, but you're saying, oh, I'm just going to give it sunlight, no water. How many healthy plants are you going to have?
Unless
0.
It's a cactus.
Yeah, exactly. And it doesn't matter which ingredient we remove. If something is required, we cannot get a healthy plant long term with 2 out of 3. And the same thing holds true for humans. So what do humans need? Humans have nutritional needs, we have structural physical movement needs, and we have emotional needs. So what this means is we need to eat well, we need to move well, we need to think well. And eating well, we've talked about what that means. You eat real food and less poison. Moving well means just what it sounds like. We need exercise. We need to move. Our physical apparatus is designed for movement. It does not function without movement. And if you try to withhold movement for any length of time, the body degenerates. The whole system, every aspect, muscular, neurological, everything degenerates. And think well, that means we have to feel good. We have to have a purpose. We have to have most of our thoughts, or at least some of our thoughts, need to be positive and hopeful. If we're always feeling bad, if we're always depressed and or stressed, then our bodies break down as well. So these are requirements of humans. Eat well, move well, think well. And of course, movement, if you have a body, if you have a spine and a body that where the joint range of motion isn't what it should be, then exercise is not going to go all the way. Exercise will help, but it will only be partially beneficial, because if the joints aren't moving, that's a bottleneck. That's a limitation in the function and communication of the body. The signals cannot develop and be generated the way that they should. And that's a different seminar. We'll take a whole seminar on that part alone. So overall, that concludes what we have to talk about for tonight. We try to keep it simple and brief. And lastly, we would like you to think about anyone that you know who would like to feel better. I think that should be 99% of the population that can benefit from, because most of them never got a user manual, and we're trying to compile one piece by piece here for you. So we want to thank you very much for your attendance, and if you have any questions, we'll be happy to take some questions at this point.